Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for being such a large audience this afternoon. It's fantastic to see you all here and to see so many friendly faces as well. Thank you for everyone being online as well. You don't have to see the cold and the rain in Perugia, but you're with us there. Thanks to the International Journalism Festival for allowing us to have this conversation together. We really want this to be a conversation, and we discussed it with all the panelists. We really want to hear from you as well, to have your questions. So we will keep some time for that at the end of the session. Do not hesitate to keep some questions for us as well. Some explanations about why we wanted to do this panel in the first place. So my colleagues at Agence France-Presse, AFP, and I did put together this panel because fact-checking, as a somewhat independent part of the media industry, but still part of it, has been around for about 20 years, sometimes longer, sometimes much younger organizations are there as well. And it's a lot. And AFP Fact Check itself was created in 2017 and has since grown from 2 journalists to 150, writing in 26 languages around the world. So after years of getting funding and attention, some may argue today that fact-checking, once the end-all be-all in the fight against misinformation, is on the decline. But we can all agree that mis and disinformation, we have seen this over and over during the festival, it's still there, right? It's still flourishing. We see that around Ukraine, we see that about the situation with Iran and Israel at the moment. We see that everywhere, and we see old footage coming back again and again, used out of context to fully fabricated content as well. So there is a question for us. Has fact-checking failed its mission? We also see a lot of harassment against journalists in general, as we were speaking in the panel just before this one on elections. But we see a lot of it for fact-checkers in particular. We see it done by online trolls, but also by institutions. And this is very concerning. For example, the government of Georgia threatened 2 fact-checking organizations recently, in the recent weeks, over accusations of foreign influence, and with a project of law that was used in the process. According to the International Fact-Checking Network's yearly report, 72% of the responding organizations said that they were facing harassment in 2023 in relation to their daily work. We also have a lot of questions about the platforms, for example. I mean, Maria earlier today was talking about her frenemies relationship with the platforms. I guess that we as fact-checkers can say something quite similar. I mean, platforms have been a major contributor to the fact-checking operations around the world, but we don't know for how long, and there is a lot of anxiety around that. We get a lot of mixed signals. We also see that the fact-checking world is in a dependence relationship with the platforms, but that we also need to work with the platforms because we want to work where it matters, where the disinformation is actually circulating. When fact-checkers were meeting at Global Fact in Seoul last year, so Global Fact is the summit, the international summit that is organized by the IFCN every year, a lot of conversations were about the state of fact-checking, its reach, its impact, its tone, its relation to audiences, and its sustainability. So after an intense period of growth in the number of fact-checking organizations worldwide, which is still continuing in a way, we find ourselves at a moment of self-reflection in terms of our impact, as well as in terms of our mid and long-range sustainability. So to explore these topics, we want to get some more inspiration from this fantastic panel that we have with us here today, which are coming from a lot of different backgrounds in terms of fact-checking, but also different experiences, different types of innovations, etc. We want to hear from you on this. So let's dive into it. First of all, I want to hand the microphone to Lucas Graves. You can start by maybe introducing yourself a little bit, and then because you have done a lot of research on that, explaining to us, like, when we are talking about fact-checking today, we hear that all the time, fact-checking, fact-checking, fact-checking. What are we really talking about? Who are the fact-checkers today? And how did this group or this community evolve since 2016?
Thanks, Marie, and thanks for organizing this panel. So I'm Lucas Graves. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin in the United States, where I study fact-checking and fact-checkers and fact-checking organizations really around the world. I'm really interested in the global fact-checking movement and how it's developed over the last 20 years. And it's a very diverse movement, and so I've been trying to come up with a good metaphor to capture that diversity. So yesterday I asked ChatGPT, as one does, and it suggested a salad bowl of skeptics. And I really, really like that. I can't figure out how to use it yet, but as soon as I do, I'm going to deploy it. But for now, we'll just say that it is a very diverse movement, and I've said, and other people have said, that really there are sort of three institutional centers of gravity for fact-checkers around the world. So one is, of course, journalism. You have a lot of very prominent fact-checking organizations that are attached to flagship news outlets like the BBC, like Agence France-Presse, like the Washington Post, etc. And then you have a whole lot of independent fact-checkers that still really come out of a journalistic tradition, like Aos Fatos in Brazil, because of the careers of the founders. So that's one sort of institutional pull. Then you have another center of gravity in the world of civil society organizations, and that's been a really important influence for fact-checking globally. So, for instance, Pagella Politica, which is the best known and longest sort of running Italian fact-checking organization, was founded by sort of 10 young policy professionals who really saw themselves as sort of political reformers, as policy experts, and not at all as journalists, right? And in fact, they sort of made a big point of that when they launched, that they were separate from the media. Correcting the media was one of their core missions. And you have a lot of fact-checkers based in civil society organizations, some of them quite activist, in Eastern Europe, also to an extent in Africa and in Asia. And then, I'll wrap up very quickly, then the third pole is sort of a lot of fact-checkers are attached to academic institutions in different ways. So for instance, Africa Check is very journalistic in its mindset, but it's also based at Wits University in Johannesburg, or factcheck.org in the United States, based at the University of Pennsylvania, or the Demagogue Network in Central Europe, where a lot of their fact-checkers are student volunteers, and they get sort of university credits. So those are the three sort of cornerstones institutionally, but it's not that organizations belong to one or the other. Rather, you've seen this incredible sort of cross-pollination and hybridization, so everyone sort of reflects influences from each of these three areas. Which is what makes it such a fascinating field to study. I'll say that there's one other really important division, and this speaks to how the field has changed, which has been the shift to a focus on debunking fake stuff online instead of mainly checking things that politicians say or things that political figures say. As recently as 2016, that was really the main focus of most fact-checking organizations around the world. There were a handful that focused mainly on debunking hoaxes online, but the great majority really centered on checking political rhetoric. And now that's completely flipped, right? And it's flipped in large part because fact-checkers since 2016, 2017, developed relationships with platform companies, commercial relationships where they're getting paid to debunk content, especially on Facebook and on Instagram. And so you saw this sweeping change across the field where now, really the main focus is that kind of work. And of course, there are still a lot of fact checkers who check politicians, at least partly, but that's really, that's a smaller part of the global field now. So I hope that's sort of a good starting point.
Thank you very much for this introduction, just to have a glimpse of the diversity of the world of fact-checking as we know it. I now want to turn to Tai Nalon. I will let you introduce yourself as well, but I also want you to speak more specifically of how, as a journalist, as an experienced journalist that you were, why did you decide to kind of go beyond to create Aos Fatos? Like, what drove you to that? And how does one fund innovation in such a way to run such an organization?
Thank you, Marie. Hi, good afternoon, all. I'm Tai. I'm the executive director of Aos Fatos, which is a first fact-checking organization in Brazil, but it's not the only thing that we do there. But my background, I was a politics reporter in Brazil for over 6 years, from 2008 to 2014. And for 3 years, I covered daily former President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. And I thought that with that background, something was quite unsettling. I think that the coverage by that time was really superficial. It was based only on statements the president and her officers did. And we didn't have much space for creating, as the demand for productivity was very difficult. So by 2014, we had a national election that was really, really polarized. It was something that happened, I think, of course, every election is polarizing, but particularly there, we started to feel what we are feeling today in our society. A division about values, a division, a large use of lies as political marketing, all of this. And when the election was over, all the fact-checking operations that were running that year basically stopped operating. But the lies, they were still there. And the politicians and the political crisis that succeeded that election were still there. So in 2015, I decided to launch Aos Fatos. And not only as a fact-checking organization, but mainly as a fact-checking organization, but thinking about having a technology approach towards, of course, fact-checking politicians' statements, but having access to structured data from efficient governments and such. So many things changed, as Lucas said, but we still are fact-checking politicians' statements.
Thank you very much as well. I will now turn to Lee to know a little bit more about your own experience, but also the work that you're doing with Africa Check. You're really working at the scale of a continent. And that makes me think, like, how does one reach out to such diverse audiences? Like, when we are talking about fact-checking, how are we talking about different formats and the different audience that you're talking to, the diversity of the audiences as well? And are you able, because you're working at that scale, to measure the impact of the fact-checking work you're doing with Africa Check?
Thanks, Marie, and hi, everyone. I wish we worked at the scale of an entire continent. It's a holy grail kind of thing for us. But I'm Mwiti. I am the editor-in-chief of Africa Check, which is the continent's first fact-checking operation, first independent fact-checking organization. And we work physically in 4 countries, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and in Senegal. But also through a network of about 50 fact-checking organizations, we then are able to have a sort of bird's eye view of the patterns and trends that we see in terms of misinformation on the continent. But it is a headache in terms of reaching out to such a diverse audience. And the key thing for us has been that, one, we need to put out content that is multilingual, right? And there's hundreds of languages on the continent, so you have to identify which have the most speakers and then put out content in those languages, and then you have to look at the formats and channels, because African culture is a storytelling culture. So you need to use mediums that speak to African people. A kind of neat example I would give is a radio interactive radio drama we flighted in Senegal and in Nigeria and on radio and Y radio. I mean, in terms of, sure, we've seen a lot of advances in bridging the data gap, the data divides on the continent, but still there's a big way to go, right? And radio remains king whichever African country you go to. And so, I mean, there are reasons for this. It is cheap, it is accessible, it is inclusive, right? And it's easy to use to pass on culturally appropriate messages. So we flighted this in Nigeria, in Senegal, and we learned quite a few lessons because the idea was that we would have a cast that would then paint out a scenario of certain disinformation to the audiences, and audiences would then call in and react, maybe support the actor who was, painting a certain scenario, or, take a stand that is polar opposite to that, right? And so we learned a few things. For example, tone matters on the continent. If you're looking to speak to audiences in Nigeria, you want to be a bit more, less formal, right? And that's pretty much the case for Anglophone Africa, but maybe I can be corrected. In Francophone Africa, you need to be a bit more formal. So, these are some of the lessons, some of the context that we picked up, from that. But also, both audiences enjoyed being part of drama, because as a continent, we are dramatic. Essentially, we like drama. We don't do dull days, right? So, you need to have content that is multilingual. You need to have strong feedback systems. Also, you want to enable your audiences to reach out to you. You want them to tell you, this is what we are seeing, these are our concerns. We think you're crap as fact checkers, so but you still need to essentially offer that channel, that feedback system, right? And so this gives us a sense of what is trending, what is what is traveling in communities, and then we can see if there's something that we could sort of come up with in terms of pushing or countering that, right? We also have been working with local influencers, with community and cultural leaders, because these have a lot of sway on the African continent. So you want to speak to people who influence the public debate, and in Africa, a lot of people still look up to these figures. So if you're working with influencers for the young groups, then it's an interesting curve also, because you're trying to see a lot of influencers use comedy, use satire. How do you bring in facts into that? You go then speak to church leaders, religious leaders, ask them to speak to the audiences about why facts are important. So you use people in the group, on the ground, and people who have influence on the community. We are also, and it's almost like a sort of holy grail for us, we are working with educational bodies and schools, on the continent, in the countries we work in, because we think that gives us the best long-term chance of, pushing back on the problem of misinformation, of bad information. So we did a sort of scoping, some 3 years back, and discovered it was almost a black hole in terms of who was doing misinformation literacy as opposed to media literacy, right? And then, we said, okay, let's try and knock on doors of governments in these countries and see if long-term we can end up in the education curriculum of schools. Has been hard going in some countries. We've had more successes in South Africa, where we are now able to speak to educators in high schools and universities to train these educators so that they can then teach their students misinformation skills, how to look out for bad information. We hope we can get into Kenya and Nigeria. We would like to ape the example of Finland, where we've seen, it's very much in schools, right? But that gives us the, in our opinion, the best chance of being able to push back long-term at misinformation, right? And lastly, I didn't mention the Africa Facts Network, which we use then to share experiences and pick up what we need to push back on, whether it's similar misinformation or different types of misinformation. So that's the first part of your question. I don't know if I should go on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all this. Well, you found a lot of different ways to talk to people. I'm turning now to Shayan Sardarizadeh. Sorry.
It's okay, don't worry about it. My mom can't say it.
It's okay. Sorry. I did practice quite a lot, but I'm still not getting there. So you're also talking to quite a lot of people online all the time about the work that you're doing. You're sharing a lot. I will let you explain more about the work that you're doing. But also what is interesting is that you are really working with BBC Verify, like at the heart of the newsroom. So I want to know, like, how does that work? Like, how does it function? Why was it created in that way? And also, what are the strengths and the potential challenges that are coming up in this editorial workflow?
So BBC Verify was created this time last year, and it basically, the BBC already had a fact-checking team called Reality Check, which was established right after, well, actually, no, it was established in 2014-15, before the 2015 general election in the UK, and then it handled the US election in 2016, and also we had a referendum, I don't know if you heard about it, in the UK in 2016, where we left the EU as a result of that referendum. So that team was very, very active. And it became basically the place for fact-checking in the BBC. But there was something lacking in the BBC's coverage, which was basically focusing on online misinformation and also open source investigations, which is that sort of work that Bellingcat pioneered and then sort of spread into other news organizations. With the rise of social media and all the conflicts that we've seen, from Syria to Ukraine to other sort of small conflicts in other parts of the world, and now, unfortunately, the Middle East, has become really a vital part of journalism these days, particularly when you want to do investigative work, conflicts. You need a team of online investigators who basically do work not based on being at a location and working as a correspondent, although that is still very, very vital and crucial. But basically just going online and looking at videos and all the stuff that is available publicly online these days. There's a whole plethora of things that people can do. And help newsrooms with that. So the team was established last year primarily to do open source investigations, but also it sort of disbanded Reality Check and brought together everybody who worked in basically fact-checking, misinformation, online extremism into sort of one team under one umbrella as BBC Verify, which I think was the correct decision. But as a result of that, things can get messy, right? Because this is there's a lot of work that you can do. You're covering open source content and conflict and mass shootings and online extremism and the tide of misinformation about all sorts of different things all around the world. And it's a lot of work. And there is a problem in newsrooms, actually. And this is not a problem unique to the BBC. I walked into tons and tons of newsrooms, and pretty much everybody who works in this field has told me the exact same thing, which is most editors in major news outlets come from the sort of background of traditional school of journalism, which is you basically check your sort of AFP, AP, Reuters feed, you go on sort of CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, France 24, Deutsche Welle, whatever it may be. And that's how you sort of get your news gathering in the morning, and you find out what's going on in the world. And then you also have your network of correspondents. We're very fortunate at the BBC to have sort of bureaus all around the world, journalists who work in all sorts of different areas. And then through that, you sort of decide what the major news stories of the day are and what you need to cover. But that is only serving not, I wouldn't say small, but just a sort of certain proportion of your audience in the year 2024. Because the days of people sitting in front of the television and catching news, or buying a newspaper in the morning and finding out what's been going on in the world yesterday, or basically talking to people in the workplace to find out what the news stories are, those days are over. When something happens these days, people just rush to online platforms, be it TikTok or Snapchat or Reddit or X or Facebook, whatever it may be, and that's where people get their news. And these days, basically, what social media has done is that basically people's attention span has gone. Like you want something quickly delivered to you. You want to find out what's going on, what the videos are, what the story is, what's happening, and you just want it in basically 10 minutes, 20 minutes. People haven't got time. People are not news junkies like us. They've got lives to look after. They've got families, they've got their work. So if you're not looking online, and if you're not consuming material online, if you don't know what's happening online, which is the case, unfortunately, with a lot of senior editors in major news organizations, you don't necessarily know the value of this type of work. You don't know about the tide of misinformation. You don't know about why fact-checking matters, and you also don't know what people are saying. And in some cases, when I speak to editors and I tell them Do you know, like this guy who posts regularly on TikTok, for instance, about news stories, and plenty of it is false. Do you know that they have a bigger reach than this major news organization? And they go, no chance. Yeah, it is true. They have a bigger reach, and they have a bigger audience. And if you're ignoring that, and if you're not tackling that, you're basically not serving your audience properly. And the other thing is, there's a whole generation of people these days who are exclusively getting their news online. I was basically doing a talk about basically misinformation and verification in Birmingham a couple of months ago to an audience of high schoolers, 250 high schoolers. And when I asked them, where do you get your news stories? Do you go on the BBC News app? Yeah, like sort of half of the audience. They were like, yeah, maybe. Do you go on the New York Times? Yeah, Washington Post, no. And I said, do you get your news on TikTok? Everybody said yes, like literally all of them. And if you're basically ignoring a platform like that, like the number of times editors have told me when I tell them, you need to cover this on TikTok, and they go, isn't that the Ad Dance app? It's like, no, it isn't. There's 1.2 billion people active on there, and your kids and your grandkids are basically getting the news on there. So you can't ignore it. You have to be there, and you have to see what's going on. And ideally, we need to move to, we'll talk about it hopefully a little bit later about where fact-checking needs to go, but we need to get into a space where we're covering and we're tracking and tackling misinformation and doing fact-checking on each platform where it goes viral.
So building on that, and building on the fact that most of the fact-checking organizations are kind of like building on their digital native side of like OSINT methodologies and looking at platforms, etc. Do you think, all of you, that fact-checking can help journalism to improve, evolve, reach out to other audiences, or is it the other way around, maybe? Because there is this problem of tone of saying, well, this is true, this is false. Like, what is the impact that fact-checking can actually have in the evolution of journalism in general? Who wants to start?
Well, I could, since I'm on this end, right? We've seen quite a bit of cross-pollination, right? And and the one thing I would say I've picked up is that a lot of journalists have taken on the skill set of fact-checking, right? Verification techniques, so they're able to use the rules, if I may call them so, of the fact-checking community, right, in their work. Also we're seeing a lot of focus on misinformation literacy, right? And I want to draw a distinction between that and media literacy, right? So a focus by the media on, on the actors of misinformation, on the channels, the incentives, right? The content, we're seeing a lot of reporting, for example, on deepfakes, right? So there has been that focus on misinformation literacy, and I like to say, this is almost a sort of extension of what the fact-checking community does on a daily, basis. We're seeing more openness. For example, if you want to be, a respected fact-checker, you need to be transparent about a lot of things, including when you get it wrong, right? So we're seeing a lot of, adoption of standards, and by no means am I saying, these are only the fact-checking community, but there's a lot of focus now on openness. Okay, we've gotten it wrong. This is how we got it wrong. And building trust with communities, and these are shared standards across both the fact-checking and the media space, right? And but I think for us, the one thing I would say we've seen in terms of the evolving of journalism is also the focus on being able to do collaborations with fact-checking organizations, right? There isn't that neat divide or even a blurring of roles anymore. We at Africa Check have spearheaded 4 election coalitions in the last 3 years. Senegal recently, South Africa with the election going, coming up May next month, right? In Nigeria last year, Kenya the year before. We have been at the forefront of putting together coalitions, that bring together fact-checkers and media organizations, and then we've seen quite a lot of enthusiasm, to work together, obviously for sharing of resources, but also for reach, and also, the end of the day, the goal really is for whether you're a fact-checker or a media practitioner for an informed citizenry. So we're seeing quite a lot of cross-pollination and also, just a lot of, appetite to work together. Of course, there's that tension about funding. There's a lot of funding for fact-checking. Maybe this funding should be coming to media organizations, but it's obviously an interesting debate. But there is a reason why fact-checking exists, and that's where the conversation needs to be.
Lucas, Tai, do you want to add anything to that?
No, actually, I don't see fact-checking and traditional journalism so apart from each other. I guess that, well, at least as a fact-checker, I don't see that way. If the other way around thinks this way, I think it's concerning. But at least in Brazil, for instance, during the Bolsonaro years, fact-checking has played somehow a difference. We saw newspapers, cable TV, news channels starting to call out his lies. Like he said something that was false, and repeatedly. And we didn't actually see that before. So I think we might have made an impact. I don't know for how long or if this will continue as years go by, but yes.
Can I just quickly jump in? Fact-checking is not flashy work. It's vital work, but it's not flashy. And obviously in the age of social media, people care more about sort of flashy journalism. But trust me, if fact-checkers and misinformation reporters and verifiers didn't exist in newsrooms, you would have seen far more mistakes than you actually do currently. Just to give you an example, these days most news organizations on their websites, which is where they get most of their audience and most of the clicks, when a big major story happens, they're on live pages. And those live pages take quite a lot of content from what's going viral online. And it's in those moments I can give you multiple examples, countless, of people who run the BBC live pages, get in touch with us and go, can we actually publish this video? Can we run this video? There's this claim going viral, and can we actually use it? What does it say? Can you actually give us more context? And in a lot of ways, if we weren't involved, there was a risk that those things would get published. Just to give you an example, last weekend there was a tragic attack in Sydney. I don't know if you know about it. There was a stabbing attack in Sydney by an individual, and unfortunately, I think 6 or 7 innocent people lost their lives. And in the aftermath of that, there was this sort of really, really bizarre but unfortunately expected battle going on between the sort of two partisan sides of the Israel-Hamas conflict. There was like the pro-Palestinian side who really, really wanted that guy to be Jewish, and the pro-Israeli side who wanted it to be like an Islamic extremist. It turned out that he is neither. But then there was, for like a few hours after that attack happened, these days when there's a terrorist attack, when there's a shooting, when there's a stabbing, unfortunately there's a community of people online who try to, before the police have basically identified that individual who's responsible, or the individuals who are responsible, they try to go find out, based on videos or images of this guy that are basically spreading online, try and go find out who that guy is. And it's okay, people are curious and it's a big story and people want to find out who that person is. In this case, because there was an inherent bias and there was this battle going on between the two partisan sides of the Middle East conflict, a completely innocent 20-year-old Jewish student, Australian Jewish student, was wrongly identified and doxxed. His entire online profile, his life was doxxed online for hours and hours and hours on TikTok, on X, on Instagram, completely wrongly accused of being the guy who did it. And a major Australian news outlet, basically, without doing basically the necessary checks, just took those viral claims on TikTok or anything and just published this. Like the guy's name, his picture, his online profile, and that's really not good, right? Like that guy, a 20-year-old student who'd done nothing wrong. Basically, he basically later on, when ABC News in Australia spoke to him, he said he'd faced a torrent of harassment because of it. But if that outlet had checked with somebody, they might already have people who do this type of work. They didn't bother to check. I don't know what happened. Maybe they don't. If they bothered to check, that mistake wouldn't have happened.
Thank you very much about that. Lucas, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think we're starting to get into the conversation about what the impacts are in general, and I hope we do that. But just when it comes to the influence on journalism, a bit of historical context. So in the United States, for instance, it's hard to imagine now, but when the first dedicated fact-checking organizations started to emerge in the mid-2000s, the ones focused on political fact-checking, there was a lot of resistance within professional journalism, within major professional newsrooms. And there were well-established journalists who argued, fact-checking is great, but it's not objective journalism because you're taking sides in political debates. It belongs on the opinion pages, which is a little nuts, right? To say that sort of the verification belongs on the opinion pages. And nobody says that anymore, right? The culture of journalism, again, in the United States, visibly shifted as a result of the influence of these professional fact-checking organizations, and it really helped to advance that long-running debate about sort of he said, she said journalism and what are good alternatives to it. So, I think we've definitely seen that fact-checking has had that sort of cultural influence on journalistic norms.
And still, we hear a lot all the time that fact-checking doesn't work, that we can't measure impact, that we don't see the results of it, that there is too much funding going towards fact-checking and not enough on media literacy, on behavior, or other aspects. How are you pushing back to that? What are you saying to people that say that fact-checking doesn't work? And disclaimer, this is a question that was given to me by Shayan in the first place. Shayan, do you want to, or Lucas, you were jumping in.
I was just going to turn this off. Sure. I find that question incredibly frustrating. It comes up all of the time. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons it's frustrating. One is sort of a kind of whataboutism. I mean, it feels as if we accept when it comes to other forms of accountability reporting that they don't always produce accountability. In fact, in most cases, they don't produce accountability, right? If you think about major data journalism projects, investigative journalism, what leaps to mind is that, that huge New York Times investigation of Donald Trump's taxes when they finally got his tax returns, and it fell, it barely made a splash, right? And it didn't lead to any sort of policy change or any political impacts. That often happens when it comes to accountability journalism, but somehow in the case of fact-checking, we argue that, it's not worthwhile if it doesn't completely eliminate political lying, and I think that's entirely the wrong way to think about it. And I'll just say that when we think about the effects of fact-checking, often the conversation is about whether it convinces people or not. Convincing people is very difficult. It's much more rare than we think. It does, in many cases, have an impact on people's beliefs, but there are many other ways that fact-checking can make change in the world. So sometimes it encourages politicians to change the way they speak. Every fact-checker can give you examples of politicians who change their rhetoric because of their work. Of course, there are many others who don't. It has changed the culture of journalism, like we've said. Fact-checkers have a direct impact through their partnerships with platforms. I mean, every fact-checker I know who's part of the Facebook partnership loves the fact that they can identify something as being misinformation, and then its circulation is immediately reduced. One fact-checker who may be in the room right now, told me once, let's just take shit down because that's a really visible way to have an impact. So I think often when we think about impact, we make a mistake by focusing just on whether it convinces everyone, that something is false, which is really hard to do.
Shayan, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, to directly answer the question, yes, it absolutely works. But I would say that, right? I'm a biased observer. So let me back it up. Let's first of all sort of knock this down on the head. If you're a fact checker, or if you're a misinformation reporter, if you're a journalist who cares about facts, you are never going to be able to get the influence and the clout and the engagement of the main and of the biggest misinformation spreaders. Never. I've tried for 7-8 years. Initially, when I started, I thought maybe I could. I haven't been able to. But that's not the point. The point is not for you to be basically fighting with some of the big. I could name names, but that wouldn't be appropriate. But if you're spending time online, you know the types of people that I'm talking about on different platforms. It's not about basically matching them in terms of audience and engagement. It's about who you can personally reach and how many minds you can change. as a fact checker, as a misinformation reporter, as a journalist who does verification, if you can change one mind, say some massive story has happened with sort of real impact and real implications in the real world that could cause harm, a major conspiracy movement, say QAnon, which was massive in America and also spread to Europe and other parts of the world as well, and obviously ruined, unfortunately, many, many lives, and a number of people I've spoken to who lost loved ones and family members and partners and parents to that awful movement. The purpose of your work should be, if something big like that happens or a big story happens and there's viral false claims, and you can change one mind, one person who saw a viral video online and believed it, one person who fell for a conspiracy movement and spent time in it, and you've helped them by doing fact-checking, get out of that movement, one person who was basically going into some extreme online movements, but based on those conspiratorial arguments, based on those false claims, and you managed to change their mind. If you've done that, you should be proud of your work, and you should take pride in what you've done. You've actually made a real-world difference. And I could tell you stories of people who've got in touch with me personally, and they've said, somebody got in touch with me and said my parents had been basically deep into QAnon, and they basically by chance they saw one of your fact checks on Twitter, and they started questioning a couple of things, and they came to me, and we had a conversation, and that was basically the beginning of the road for them to get out of it. And I bet if you speak to other colleagues on the panel and other fact checkers who do similar work, they will have similar stories to tell you. So that's the impact. Never let anyone tell you it doesn't work. It does.
Thank you very much. I can confirm that we have some of these success stories at AFP as well, among a lot of harassment, but we have them as well. Tai, you wanted to jump in?
Actually, I think that if there is a specific group of journalists that are making difference in some democracies in the world, are fact checkers. At least in Brazil, at Aos Fatos, I opened my laptop here just because I don't want to speak anything that might be misleading. But in the past years, we have fact-checked Bolsonaro's statements every day, all the days that he spent in office. And we reached the number of over 6,000 false or misleading statements made by him in 4 years in office. These statements, this fact-checking project was mentioned in an investigation conducted by a special commission at the Congress in Brazil. And they regarded it as the data simply proves that the lies were indeed a practice of the government, which benefited from the disinformation scheme. And this statement, together with this report, subsidized Bolsonaro's prosecution in Brazil. So I don't see an impact more evident than this. This is why fact-checking was created, actually. Of course, Bolsonaro is around there saying what he says. Yes, of course he does. He has the right to do that. And we have the right to fact-check.
Thank you very much. Lee, if you want to add a final comment to that before we get to the room for questions.
Yeah, I think in terms of the question if fact-checking works, I think it helps to acknowledge the concerns of those who are critics of fact-checking, right? A lot of the criticism we get tends to be, for example, accurate information is outpaced by bad information, right? Or we don't shift the needle on people who have really had or cast iron perceptions, right? What behavioral scientists call motivated reasoning, we don't, affect that demographic, or we just bias depending on which side of the divide we've upset, right? So it's important to acknowledge the criticism, right? But then also we then must explain our work much better. And this would essentially entail that we're not looking, and it's great if we can change the minds of some people, but we're not looking to necessarily change minds, but to improve the overall accuracy of information that is available to the public, right? And also to inculcate or foster critical thinking skills in the public, right? And that I think it's important to communicate that fact-checking is only one spoke of the wheel. There's media literacy initiatives, there's a whole multi-pronged approach you can take to the problem of bad information in society, and fact-checking is only one of them, right? But having acknowledged the concerns, having explained our work, because I don't think we really do a good job of explaining our work, then it's important, and probably the hardest step is to ask for the help of the critic, right? Okay, so you think we should have shut up shop yesterday, right? What do you think we should do differently? Do we need to work faster? Do we need to work at the whole of society level, or just certain demographics? Do we need to be more innovative, right? And so have that conversation around what we can do better, and that way you're able to, one, communicate, or rather address any misconceptions, but also take onto board their concerns around fact-checking. So it's about just having a conversation, acknowledge, explain ourselves much better, and then see if we can partner with our critics. Yeah, they do say no statue was ever erected for a critic, but yeah, they keep us on our toes.
Thank you very much. It's great to see that fact-checking is here to stay, at least for a while.
Look, I think when we are really good at what we do, then we will have worked ourselves out of a job. And I'd be happy to not be doing fact-checking anymore, look for another source of gainful employment, but that obviously will take some time, and I'm happy not to have a job, having done my job well. Right.
Definitely. Do we have any questions from the room? Yes, we do.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring discussion. My name is Aleksandra Monkos. I'm a live fact-checker from Poland, the Magog Association. Thank you for mentioning us before. And what we do, we of course verify politicians' claims, we debunk fake news online, but we also educate. And we do educate pupils at schools, people from NGOs, but recently after the full-scale invasion, also business and journalists. And I wanted to ask about building trust between journalists or media professionals and fact-checkers, especially those working for CSOs, as I do. So what would you recommend? What are your experiences? How can we build the bridge when there is often the lack of trust from each side, and the fact-checkers are seen as constant criticists? Maybe there are some ways, like for example, mutual republishing before the elections. This is what we've done with some of the media outlets in Poland, but I would like to know more of the inspirations of what can be actually done more to achieve this cooperation and reach wider audience to provide this quality information. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Shayan wanted.
Yeah, quickly a few things, and that's an excellent question. And there's a massive danger for the fact-checking community to be seen as basically partisan or part of the establishment. We aren't, and we shouldn't be seen as such. Number one thing I would say, make sure that your coverage, I'm sure it is, but it's completely objective. Make sure you're fact-checking everyone from anyone who has power, anyone who has any kind of influence or power. We should always leave people without power alone. We live in free countries and people have the right to say whatever they want. It's the people with power who count. And we should make sure that we fact-check people from the right, left, center, upside down, downwards, sideways, whichever side it is. And if we find that in our coverage, one side is exclusively getting more fact-checks and more coverage, we have to question whether we are in a bubble ourselves, and and we have to diversify our sources of information, because trust me, it's not a right-wing problem or a left-wing problem. It's a universal problem. Number two, I would say try and dissociate yourself from the platforms. One of the major issues in the fact-checking community is, unfortunately, we have to be some fact-checking organizations have to be dependent on the platforms because they provide some funding, thankfully, and money is always a problem. And second, they provide they have an agreement that the platform provides some of the content that needs to be fact-checked, but provides them with a sort of specific dashboard of content that they can fact-check, and that's good. But it has to stay at that level. We should not be seen as people who call for censorship, and call for people to be banned, and call for voices to be taken down. We should be at the forefront of defending free speech and the right of people to say what they want. Misinformation should not involve governments. Governments should not be regulating speech. Everyone who wants to spread misinformation or falsehoods on the internet should be allowed to do so, because we live in free societies, and the dangers of banning that stuff is much, much bigger for societies than the misinformation itself. But we should also have the right to fact check them. And then, I trust the sort of judgment of people to see the information and then make up their minds. And I think most people are good people, decent people, and want factual information. And the last thing I would say, we're all human, we make mistakes. When you make a mistake, hold your hands up and say, I made a mistake, correct the record, and be honest about it. So the audience, people understand that we're human and we make mistakes. We're not machines, we're not robots, we make mistakes. The important thing is to maintain the trust of your audience, is to be honest about it. When you make a mistake, you're honest, this is a mistake, correct the record, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And the last thing is try to spread the knowledge. You talked about basically going to places, educating people, universities, schools, but also senior citizens. That's a part of the of society that doesn't get served well enough. I think young people are much more creative and much more sort of savvy when it comes to tech platforms. Older people, not necessarily. And not always. I mean, you can't, I know people older than me who are much better than me at sort of surfing the internet. But generally speaking, that is the case. So make sure you spread the knowledge and spread the ability to fact check and verify. And then people can do it for themselves. And once they can do it for themselves, they will see that what you're doing is actually based on facts and what the others are doing is not.
Thank you very much. We have 1 minute left, so let's have the second question here. Yes. And we'll end on that, I'm afraid.
Dear friends, it's Gülin from Turkey. So my question is, if you could change only one thing, one moment, one decision in the history of the fact-checking or in the community, what would it be to create more impact in the society? But the money is a restricted answer, so thank you.
Who wants to take it?
Look, if there are no volunteers, I'll start. So if I could change one thing, and that's a very interesting question, right? I would say we could have focused and should focus more on pre-banking, right? As opposed to trying to keep up with the bad stuff. So get the good stuff out way before the bad stuff has that opportunity to gain traction. So, and I think probably that should be the future. We're focusing on, educating audiences rather than running or trying to keep up with whatever is traveling or trending in communities. So that pivot should have happened way earlier than it is happening now. And I think there's a case to be made that funders would be more interested in that kind of longer term approach, than, okay, so does it work? You have been outpaced. So I would have loved to pivot to pre-banking, earlier than I did.
I wouldn't focus so much on Twitter.
Good wisdom.
Yeah, agree 100%. So very quickly to sort of add to that, the fact-checking community has two problems at the moment. First of all, the traditional way of fact-checking in the sort of rapid information space is not as effective as it used to be. We have to expand the concept of live fact-checking. And live fact-checking comes with a lot of risk because fact-checking and verification takes time and it's not always possible to fact-check immediately. But say when the Iranians have launched missiles towards Israel, and at that night, tons and tons of material is going viral on Instagram or Facebook or on TikTok or on X. You have to be fact-checking there and then, because by next morning, if you want to sort of write an article and then publish and then put it on your social media account, it's too late. You have to do it live at source on those platforms. That's a problem we're lacking. And we also don't have enough TikTok fact-checkers at the moment. We need that. We need personalities on TikTok.
We get your point. Lucas, for the conclusion.
Just very briefly, fact-checkers' biggest successes have come from being organized. So organizing earlier, organizing more is the most promising route.
So there's so much more we would like to discuss. We had lots of other questions for our panelists here. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to the audience as well. You were really, we could feel that you were there with us in the room. And thanks to the festival, and see you soon.